When he says we're good to go. So thank you. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to Untold Insights. Today is really, as always, just a conversation about the things that matter to you, the things that you've done, and really to kind of try and unlock where you, as a practitioner in data, are seeing changes and adaptations. So firstly, I'd just love you to introduce yourself so that people get to know you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me. I'm Nik Lampropoulos, so I'm the founder and CEO of a data and AI consultancy, Shapes and Numbers. And I'm happy to be here to talk about data, applications of data, AI, and great, anything you want.
So how did you come to that point? What did you do previously to this? What was your history in data? What led to this point in time?
How much time do we have? I mean, it's, I want to say it was an accidental thing, but it is kind of premeditated as well at the same time.
Sure.
So I had a business degree, but it was, when technology was starting to become a big thing, and I wanted to dive into it more and understand the nitty-gritty, what's happening behind the scenes, and, answer why this works this way and doesn't work that way, and how we can use it in a business context, right? Whether it is through management information systems or, with data mining back then and all of these great applications. So long story short, I decided I wanted to do something more technical. So I started technology. It was the boom of, the web era, I guess.
Yeah.
So I did that for a number of years, worked on the product side, development side, before I started moving kind of back to the business side of things and understanding more how practically systems, applications, data influence decision-making, make us better, make us perform better, and what we can learn from that.
Sure. So I guess you came full circle. It's interesting. So we've talked to a number of people on this podcast, and we have people who kind of come from being data scientists and they come into the other end. But everyone, it always comes back to use case, right? And it sounds like very much you started on the use case end. You're like, okay, there's this interesting stuff, there's this technology happening, people are playing with data. How are they using it? How are they practically using it to improve their business, change functions, so on and so forth? That's cool. And in that journey, obviously, like, you've obviously seen the growth and development of data within organizations. There's often, there's this term, which I guess, I don't know, it's slightly triggering for me, which is like, we're data driven.
Oh, yeah.
And, the reason it's sort of slightly triggering is obviously, like, I just want to know what that means, right? And so, when we think about being data driven, we just think about the fact that, hey, we have some information and this is helping us to forecast or make decisions in the business. But I don't think it's as simple as that. I think that, data is an asset in a business that isn't just about insight, right?
Absolutely.
How would you categorize data as an asset within a business? Like, what do you see as its fundamental use, and what do you see as what are the functions that it actually performs within the business, rather than just saying, okay, we can do some insights? I think there's more to it than that. I'd love to get your view on it.
100%. Yeah. So it's a very interesting one, because I'm with you. The word data driven has been seriously abused, I would say. So it's not just, something everyone uses. It's also, variations of it, data driven versus data led versus data informed, right? Yeah. So there are so many different ways of actually describing what you can understand, what, can you make sense of data, and how you can actually use it, practically speaking, right? So in a business context. So I think, to your point, to your question, for me, when we say data as a business asset, we see the journey, I guess, from the technical term around data, right, and the computer science kind of discipline, to now understanding how these little kind of nuggets of information essentially can help us really understand how we perform, how we do things, understand, the insights you mentioned is, I think, one application, right? Is one way of understanding or of utilizing data, right? So you sit with it, you try to organize it, you try to see what, how you can put it together, synthesize, and then from there derive some insights and establish some basic understanding, right, of the problem, I guess, you're studying at this point. But there are many more applications. I think, when we say business as an asset, I think it is literally, when you look at businesses, is something that you can utilize in terms of potentially directly selling to consumers or other businesses, for example, right? So that's another application. There are also applications, especially these days with AI, right, in terms of feeding more advanced use cases and feeding AI models, creating some predictive models, doing a number of different applications, right? So I think data is this kind of ingredient, I would say, describe it as, that then help you, enable you, or empower you, if you prefer, to drive a number of different actions. So depending on, people call it business intelligence, analytics, again, all of it is about sitting down with it, understanding it, applying some context, and then driving some actions, essentially.
Absolutely. And I think, and I think that's the thing, right, is that when we think about it as just being this insight thing, it becomes very passive. Whereas actually, if you think about data is also about optimization, really. And insight is like the short stop to optimization. It's this man in the middle that says, okay, I see this information and now I have to understand the context, and then I have to apply some kind of business rule. And actually, increasingly we're getting to a point where that short stop in the middle is less and less necessary. If you think about kind of RAG, right, as a capability. And really, you can use that to pull information from documents that allow you to prioritize information immediately to a human being in relation to other things they've looked at or other things that they've liked. And so, I think, obviously, as we expand upon the use cases and it becomes more and more of a fixture of these businesses, I am seeing like a much more of a shift towards people being more scared to use it. For sure. And AI has definitely escalated that because people see business risk. But I think across the board, we're seeing this shift now where people are caring a lot more about actually where does that data live? What is that asset? Where did it come from? And so data governance, we're very keenly focused on that. Are you seeing a lot of that in the work that you do? Are people caring about that enough yet? Or are you seeing them starting to care about it, but they're not there? Like, where are they in the journey?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think, so data governance obviously has been this unsexy thing that in the past, it's been around for a while. It's nothing new. It's been kind of originally, not everyone likes it. It's been kind of forced to IT teams originally, I guess, as a means of, kind of organizing this information, managing this information, and securing these assets, right? But I think it has now evolved into something bigger, and I do see the transition. I do see changes happening right now, especially, again, we live in the AI era right now, and so
absolutely,
good data governance plays an even more important role right now. So I do see teams and individuals trying to make a lot more effort around data governance practices. It's not seen anymore as the kind of necessary evil. It's also something that we need to consider seriously, especially if we want, for example, to avoid any kind of, hallucinations or any kind of issues with ethics, privacy, regulations. We have GDPR. There are other, statewide laws in the US and elsewhere, obviously, which put a lot more focus on securing, making sure that this information is stored in a proper way, is managed in a proper way, and also is then being utilized in a way that is acceptable by all parties.
Absolutely. But I think that's where the misconception lies, right? And it is a misconception in what data governance is, because many people see it as a blocker. Right? actually, I think that blocker is more it's more operational and procedural by virtue of not being taken care of, right? So we have a client where, you know, they have dozens, maybe even hundreds of Tableau interfaces. And when they want to add a new field, they have to fill in an MS form and send it to IT in order for them to go find that field and make it available to them. And that, as you can imagine, you're like, why? Why am I having to do this? Why am I filling in a form to get access to data that I just want to show on a spreadsheet that's in you know, what might as well be a spreadsheet in some instances in Tableau, that's going to an internal team anyway. And it's not, you know, it's passive, it's not interactive, they can't pull it. So you can understand that.
Yeah.
But actually the misconception is that data governance should be an enabler, right? Right?
100%. I think that's the only way to see it. I think because otherwise, again, there are misconceptions, as you said. I think if you ask different people, they will give you different answer, right, in terms of the definition and what that means to them. And I think in some instances, obviously, depending on the application, the industry they work in, you know, whether it is heavily regulated or not, you know, there are additional requirements, and for them, it's more of a nice to have, right?
Yeah.
Whereas in the past, for, I guess, everyone else, outside of a regulated environment, it would be something that maybe we should do it, maybe it is beneficial, maybe, but then when it comes down to investment, then the question is, should we actually do it, or is there anything else maybe that will give us, you know, kind of a better advantage if we invest in, or let's do something else and then we will come back and revisit that, right? And I've seen this so many times.
Right.
And to your point earlier about, you know, business functions, sharing data, you know, interacting with different types of data, that's when you get to then you realize the actual pain point, right? And then realize, what did I do? What have I been doing all this time? Right. What if I had applied this right data governance principles, and now maybe my life would have been easier, would have been, you know, whatever it is, insights to market might have been faster, my development cycle might have been shorter, whatever that is, right? Implementing a new model or training a new model might have been faster. The whole process might have been different.
Sure. And I guess it's the why, right? Yeah. It's the why. And that's the challenge. I think because it's been an unsexy area, you don't necessarily have business leaders selling it. The people who are there to sell in the business, you have like internal teams having very dry discussions about like the importance of data governance. Whereas in actual fact, you know, if you were to think about it in terms of just accessibility and observability, right? Those two functions, which I think you just kind of described, is actually I can more quickly access information that's relevant to a use case in another part of the organization that I have no necessarily reason to interact with for any other reason. And I never would have known this data existed were it not for this infrastructure that allows me to see it. So that accessibility and observability. Do you have many examples in like where you've seen this transition where people are successfully doing this? Like where they're implementing good governance and actually it's having like a critical impact on their business?
I will answer your question, I guess, slightly differently. I have examples. I'm not going to name...
No naming names.
Companies. Yeah, no names. But there are companies that came to this kind of realization, kind of the hard way,
right?
Where, you know, especially us, again, AI now is moving fast, and we operate in, you know, the media and advertising world where, you know, change is rapid, things have to happen fast. So now AI has become, you know, a very hot topic, and everyone is talking about and practical applications of it.
Yeah.
So then if you go back a step, if you take a step back and see how am I actually able to enable that to empower any kind of AI application, you realize that you need some good foundation, right? AI runs on data, right? It doesn't run on something else, on water or something else. It runs on data. So then you come to the realization that what kind of data do I have, both in terms of the volume, right? It's the breadth, it's the depth of data, it's also the quality of data, right? So then you start to think deeper and see what kind of data governance practices you have in place, or maybe you need to put in place in the future, right? And how quickly can you do that? So I see companies going, kind of full circle pretty much right now. Initially engaging a little more with data governance, kind of letting go for a while because there were other higher priority things to focus on, right?
Business
and then
issues.
coming back full circle to now say, actually, it is an important thing. It is an important topic. We need to have a good data foundation to be able to then feed our AI use cases.
Yeah. So in effect, the opposite has become true of what we were talking about earlier, which was that data governance has been seen as a blocker, but actually in relation to AI, data governance is the enabler.
It's the enabler for sure.
Right? It's not. It's the opposite of a blocker, and I think that's absolutely true. We'll touch on AI and application in a little bit, but I think this is one of the things that you and I talked about previously in this concept that you have, which is having both offensive and defensive data strategies. In this instance, especially kind of when you talk about breadth, depth, quality, and I think the other thing to mention there is sensitivity. How does that correlate, and how does all of these new applications of AI, how does that relate to having a data strategy that's offensive and defensive, and describe that to us? Like, what is an offensive strategy? What is a defensive strategy?
Yes,
in your mind.
Of course. So a defensive strategy is basically when you design a strategy that will make you efficient, will make sure that will guarantee that you make the proper use of data management practices, and you use your data, you utilize your data in a way that are kind of acceptable based on best practices, perhaps, but then also in a state that will help you drive business actions, right? But then the difference between that and the offensive approach is that offensive, you see data not just as something I need to use, something I need to manage, I need to regulate and protect. It's also something that I can use in my benefit and drive, for example, generate some new revenue streams. So you can see it as a monetizable asset.
Right.
So we talked about already data as an asset, as a business asset, but now you see, following an offensive kind of strategy, you see how that actually fits the wider picture, and how that can become, kind of a powerful thing to have in your capacity, right, and in your business.
Right. So offensive is about outcomes, right? So it's about...
So offensive is more about driving results, driving outcomes, being able to generate, and when we say monetization, there is also, I think, a little bit of misconception there.
Yeah.
So that itself can mean a number of different things. So monetization is obviously creating new data products, creating new, creating intelligence that, you can then monetize, sell, to on a B2B kind of fashion, or, directly to consumers. Creating new services, all of that is part of, one way of monetizing your data. But there is also monetization can also mean, streamlining your processes and your business operations, right? Looking at your how you operate, on your ways of working, making sure that you're more efficient, cost savings and stuff like that. So this is the other side of the same coin.
Driving margin as a means of monetization. I think that's, I think that's probably the most undervalued, if we kind of call it the data monetization sector. And I think you're right. Data monetization has been hijacked largely by the ad tech and martech community, right? So they think about, okay, we're going to segment some consumers, we're going to sell that data in open marketplaces, LiveRamp, or whatever it might be, and we're going to derive some value from it, or it's in, the cookie-based world, cookie-based targeting. But obviously, that's changing fundamentally because identity is changing, right? So deprecation of cookies within Google, and they're hashing IDs from temporary IDs from Apple and so on. So I think we will see that shift in terms of terminology now, as that data monetization becomes less and less of a reality in relation to kind of just direct outreach kind of model. Obviously AI is coming into that as well, and I think it's very challenging, because I find the idea interesting, but I think that in relation to AI, talking about having an offensive AI strategy right now is very challenging.
Mm-hmm.
Are you having those conversations, and how are you having those conversations? Because people are obviously naturally, and I think rightfully, nervous about the application of AI.
Absolutely. I think, by the way, I don't think when we say defensive and offensive, there is no silver bullet, right? And
No,
there is no kind of single way of, defining your strategy. And it's, if you see it as a spectrum, obviously they are on the two different ends.
Yeah.
But I think, in my view, you need to have a strategy that kind of combines both.
Mm-hmm. Of course.
So you can be partially defensive and partially offensive. Maybe you have, obviously, and again,
it's like a football team.
Exactly. But also, you need to be able to adjust and adapt, and whether it is your entire strategy or your tactics as well, based on the environment you're in, right? The resources you have, the quality of your data when it comes down to your data,
and breadths, and
the breadth and all of that, right? The stage you are in terms of the maturity as well. Data literacy is still a huge thing in organizations these days. So there are so many reasons, so many factors that might influence exactly whether you're following a defensive or an offensive strategy. And I think there is the right mix to be achieved here. You can be, again, I don't know what that is, 40% defensive, 60% offensive, and then maybe in next year, or you start defensive, and then when you've built up these capabilities that you need, you then start the offensive game. Right?
For sure. Yeah, I think that comes down to industry and specific companies. I think where, if you're in the financial industry, obviously a lot of what let's say you're a bank, you're going to have to play a big defensive game, right? Your big defensive game has to be big, because highly sensitive data that can be used, for identity fraud and theft and all these other things. Whereas, if you're just talking about meal plan subscriptions, in that instance, the data, other than obviously credit cards and so on, which generally goes to third parties these days anyway, you can take a highly offensive, perspective on that. Right? And so, it is defined very much by the industry and the use case. But I guess, the question was more because, we said we'd touch on AI, and, I am obviously interested. It's a big part, I think, of what you're doing today, because everyone's asking questions. And having an offensive AI strategy, obviously, if we have the data governance in place so on, you feel protected, that's fine. Not everyone is there. But if you are a business that's interested in AI, most people are looking at AI from an external application perspective, right? Like they think about agents or how do you take an offensive strategy in that instance? How do you best advise them to move forward with an offensive AI strategy today? That's my question. So I think that's something everyone's interested in, right?
Yeah. So I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all solution again. And I think it's a little early. First of all, when we say AI and offensive strategies with AI, I think we need to be a little more specific, right? Because AI,
covers a lot.
Can mean a number of different things, right? Are we talking about Gen AI, for example, now, and specific tools around AI? Are we talking about machine learning?
Yeah.
Are we talking about what kind of applications, what kind of use cases?
Sure.
Because I'd like to approach AI from a use case perspective, right? Because otherwise it gets too generic, and we can talk about this forever. But I think AI, at the end of the day, for me at least, and at this stage, before we get to the point where we have AGI, at this point, it's a tool. It's a useful tool. It's an extension of what we were able to do, much faster, much more efficient, more effective right now. But you need to examine the use case first to see its application.
So let's flip the script and say, okay, so what are the primary use cases that you're seeing that are actionable today, and give people the opportunity to kind of move into AI in a way that, I guess, because every business wants to identify how they can use it, and most people are still going through, to your point, the data literacy journey.
Yeah.
So where are you seeing those use cases that are allowing people to be where they are, but get ahead?
Yeah, I mean, in the media and advertising world, there's definitely a lot of conversation right now. to a certain extent, I will say there is some sort of hype around AI
Of course.
as well. But you see how it makes a big impact in terms of, content generation. Now people experimenting more with, Gen AI tools and capabilities that, again, there are many other questions we can talk about this if you want, whether, AI is going to replace creativity and human beings and stuff like that. That's a whole separate topic. But to your point, there are multiple applications, especially in that sector, in terms of automations as well. How can, we reduce the number of steps in terms of how we do things, how we deliver things, how we deliver content, how efficiently we can measure the impact of what we do,
Right.
which is still a big kind of question, an area of interest.
Yep.
So can you measure the impact, the effectiveness of everything that you do? And AI, I think, has a great application there as well.
Yeah.
There are applications also in terms of, helping with data literacy, for example, right? So there are many businesses, there are many organizations also that enable this ChatGPT type of, applications.
Conversational
conversational AI, enabling users to ask questions, to find answers, tap into their data assets. And it's a nice way of now interfacing with your data assets, where before you had to have this kind of technical knowledge to be able to leverage this data, interact with it, right? Query the data and get answers. So now this has become a lot easier, obviously. So these are primary applications of, the AI tools these days. Obviously, there is a lot of conversation about the potential of AI and whether we're there yet, or, there are future use cases that I think we'll see down the line. But I think we just need to contain ourselves a little bit. There are so many use cases that don't necessarily require AI.
Yeah. Well, it's also ones that just companies don't have the scope for, So conversational AI, and I mean, that's why I kind of mentioned agents earlier, and we've already seen some like horrific gaffes. Have you seen like the videos of like the Tesla calling the Tesla bot calling up and trying to, sell someone a Tesla and just going around and assuming they just get caught in the loop forever, and all kinds of other gaffes and things, which is fun to see. It's relatively harmless, I think, at this point, except for the fact that in many of those instances, what was interesting to me was that they weren't actually revealing themselves to be an AI bot, which I found quite challenging.
Yeah.
But in either case, I think it does come down to the individual use case. For instance, custom LLMs. Like I've had conversations with various people in various companies about this, and in most instances, to create some kind of LangChain-esque custom LLM, you need a lot of data and a lot of good quality and well-structured, and as well well-structured and the unstructured data to be in place as well. I just don't see that being, for most companies, a realistic use case.
I think it's pretty early to
make that assumption, maybe.
Make the assumption. The assumption is right, I think, but it's again. I like to use. Are you familiar with Amara's law? So, for our viewers as well, so Amara's law basically states that it's from this amazing scientist, researcher, and futurist called Roy Amara, who stated that we tend to overestimate the effect of the technology in the short run and underestimate the effect in the long run. So I think this is exactly the application now, the case now with AI, for example, right? So it's still relatively early to understand exactly the long-term impact that it's going to have on, as a whole in several industries. But we see smart applications right now, which I'm all about, and, where there is, again, room for improvement, or there is the right kind of appetite also to experiment a little bit, because that's another element that, I think we need to consider when it comes down to this kind of tools and use cases these days. We can talk more about, where they are now. For example, LLMs, as you mentioned, I think it's still early. Obviously, ChatGPT made everything very kind of popularized, I guess, the whole concept of LLMs, large language models. I think down the line, and that might be just a prediction, I think open source LLM models might be the answer. Obviously, that you train with your own private data, obviously, within your own kind of secure environment.
Pre-trained LLMs.
Because otherwise the costs, at least at this point, who knows, maybe in a couple of years, again, we might be talking something completely different. But at this point, to train your own data, to have your own infrastructure, to do a lot of that requires a lot of resources, right? Not everyone is there yet.
Absolutely. And actually, even with those open source, so if you look at the latest like Llama release, in order to run that, I mean, you need, probably 16 GPUs realistically you can't run it on a local machine.
Yeah.
And so, that's kind of a quantifiable resource as an organization that you'd have to factor in, but they're still cheap ultimately because, even those GPUs, you can rent those, you can gain access to them through other mediums. And so I do, to me, rather than the fully customized LLM, I do see that bridge point of, pre-trained. And actually some of these are miraculous. Like, I did a lot of observation and testing of ChatGPT, especially for 4.0, versus, other products in the market, particularly from Google, that there's no reason why ChatGPT should perform better because it works off of a much smaller training set and has less access to things like PDF data extraction. For whatever reason, it's excellent at it, and you can't explain it. And that's the other thing when we come, talking about experimentation, even like going through the process of understanding which model to use. And most companies, unfortunately, I think are going to get trapped in alignment to some degree in that respect. But I still think they can obviously extract a huge amount of value from it. Touching on creativity, I'm really interested in that because I think I see human creativity slightly differently. That let's say it's the formulation of the collective, right? Everything's iterative. Picasso said, a great artist steals, a poor artist borrows, right?
Yeah.
And how is AI any different? It's iterative. It's just taking what's been and just making variations on a theme.
There are many similarities when it comes down to, the human brain and the cognitive capabilities of human beings and AI.
Yeah.
So, for example, the human brain has the ability to synthesize, right? To collect information, bits and pieces from different places and put it all together and make sense of it, right? So similarly, AI can do that as well to a certain extent.
Yeah.
Although I think, human brain can go to a deeper level. Also, as human beings, we learn many times by association, right? So our synapses, kind of create these amazing interactions and try to understand, sometimes by relevance, right? Have I seen this before? What does that mean? And all of that happens in, nanoseconds.
Yeah.
So obviously AI is able to associate and learn, by example, right?
100%. But I would say, coming back to your point, Moore's Law earlier, and this short-term versus long-term, one of the really interesting tests, sorry to interrupt here, but I just, because this was really interesting to me, was that it was a long time ago that a smart machine beat the world's best chess player at chess, right? However, AI still struggles to beat Go masters at Go.
Mm-hmm.
And the difference is in how that game is played. With chess, it's a certain number of moves ahead, and there's a certain structure to the board and the moves, and people play in highly defined ways. There's certain types of offensive tactics and certain types of defensive tactics, so it's quite structured. With Go, you have to perceive ahead rather than look behind, and it's highly unstructured in that way. And AI really struggles with forethought. It's very good at that extraction and going, okay, this is something iterative, and I think I can produce something that looks a bit like this, but is and within the parameters of what you've asked for. But when you ask it for forethought, I think it still struggles, and I think that's the difference.
Yes.
Right.
So I started by stating the similarities, I guess. but obviously there are differences in terms of, the depth, the human brain versus AI can go into, or the speed, right? The efficiency. Sometimes, obviously, to give AI, this one, I guess, doesn't get the brain fog, doesn't get exhausted as the humans actually do.
Yeah. Especially on repetitive tasks.
Absolutely. But then going back to creativity and the point you raised, I think, there is, I like AI for what it is and what it can offer. But I think we need to be, at some point, we need to take a step back and understand a little bit how we see our relationship with AI, right? And especially in such a space like the creative space.
Yeah.
I've heard so many different views, of AI being the creative, human beings being the curators, and all of those. I don't think, human creativity has anything to worry about, when it comes down to AI. I think that is a very unique feature of humanity.
Yeah.
Everyone is creative, I think, in so many different ways. When we talk about art, for example, you mentioned Picasso, there is an element of originality, but we all have references. The most creative, the most successful artist has references, people they're influenced by, all of that. So I think in that regard, there are, again, similarities in where I see AI can help, for example, with, brainstorming, with, bringing these references to human people who can then benefit from that. But I think, as you said, humans can be, be more stochastic and being able to foresee things that in a different way, because I think the human brain is quite a complex kind of mechanism, right?
Yeah.
That we still haven't tapped into fully. So I don't see how it,
which an AI could potentially help with.
I mean, again, when we get to the point where AGI, and again, I said earlier, we need to define our relationship before it's too late, by the way.
Yeah.
And that's a whole conversation around ethics as well. But with AGI, for example, artificial general intelligence, which potentially can work as an extension of the human brain or as a way to augment our capabilities, our cognitive capabilities.
Yeah.
Again, how do we strike the right balance and use this for what it is?
Yeah. Yes.
So we do a lot of the human processing, and then we have, for example, tedious tasks, as we said, that can be then handled by someone else.
And that, I think, humanity being ready for kind of AGI is a huge topic of debate, and not something that, I think we're not going to solve today.
No.
But, more, I think, and that's ahead. I mean, actually, that being said, most people were predicting where we are in AI today, we would be in 10 to 15 years from now.
Yeah.
So the speed towards AGI is probably much sooner than we think, and we are largely unprepared. But going back, I guess, to kind of our audience and what we do, I guess, where I'd kind of like to land here is, what should we be telling organizations today about AI in simple terms, where the conversation starts in the right way? Because this is what we're talking about, right? How do you start the journey, and how do you have the right conversations so that they're not kind of being led by the nose of what's the industry and AI and all of the noise, and so much noise out there.
Yeah.
Right? How do you start the conversation about AI for an organization?
That's an amazing point. And there's a couple of things, I guess, I would say. So one is, first of all, we need to be able to help the businesses, help organizations and individuals navigate this chaos, I guess, and, cut through the complexity and I think the misinformation that exists out there.
Yeah.
So I think for people who understand, work with AI and data, I feel like it's their mission as well to communicate, not educate necessarily, because sometimes educate has the kind of wrong connotation.
Especially in the workplace.
Exactly. Just communicate, just talk about the different angles and the different points of view, and try to obviously elevate the conversation to a point where you can openly discuss, the impact that, AI has in certain areas, right? So, and again, when we talk about AI, I said it earlier, I'm going to say it again, I want to approach this from a use case perspective, right? What it is that we're trying to solve here. How can we solve it? Let's find the right tool. Let's find the best way to do that. and maybe as part of this process, does it really need, at this point, AI?
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So that is one thing. How do you navigate the fluffy, I guess, conversations around AI?
Yeah.
I think we all, and as citizens of this world as well, need to educate ourselves, first of all. I don't believe in, certain authorities necessarily to have this task and, educate everyone else. Everyone needs to do their own thing in terms of understanding and making sense of this new kind of world.
Yeah.
And what that brings into our daily life or our professional lives.
Sure.
And the second thing I wanted to say is, if we see it right now, how I would answer if someone, from a business environment asked me about AI again, clearly AI has a number of different characteristics that other disruptive technologies in the past had, for example, right?
Yeah.
So it's the speed, it moves actually very fast. It also creates, I would say, according to Clayton Christensen and his innovator's dilemma, characteristics of disruptive technologies, for example, the supply of the technology being higher than the actual demand of the market.
Yeah.
And I think we can see that to a certain extent right now, right? Everyone is still kind of trying to understand what they can do, make sense of AI, how they can help their industry, their businesses, their teams with their daily tasks, and maybe creating an offensive strategy.
Yeah.
But I think we just need to, again, do it on a case by case kind of basis. And I would also say there is still so much that we will experience maybe over the next year or so. If you can imagine, over a year and a half ago, 2 years ago,
no one was having this conversation.
No one was having, because I think, there was this explosion, I guess, of ideas and, topics just off of ChatGPT, for example, right? And LLMs.
Yeah.
So I think it's still relatively early. And we touched on experimentation, right? So I think for curious people and curious companies, there is a great kind of environment now to experiment.
Yeah.
But that requires some sort of
cost-effective as well.
And cost-effective as well. I mean, the technology is out there right now, and it gives the opportunity to everyone pretty much play with it, understand how they can use it in their benefit, right? And then make the required changes to incorporate it fully into their environment and into their use cases. But what I would also say is, as a disruptive technology, you have to give yourself permission to experiment. So whether that practically means having some sort of budget, patience, trust in your people to actually drive some new AI initiatives, have the patience to see the outcome as well. Because sometimes, and again, we talked about the data governance piece, the data foundation. If that's not there, you might have to go back while you're experimenting and fix that, which might take a little longer than you expected. So I think we all need to approach this with an open mind.
Sure.
And the spirit of experimentation, not because it's an experimental necessarily technology itself, but the application of it in certain business use cases can be.
I'd say the term experimental, I think that the reality is that it's here, whilst it falls within the disruptive technology framework, it is by far and away a much bigger development than the application of social media or the internet or, smartphones, in so much as the broad range of areas of business that it can touch and the kind of impact that it could have. So you have to do it. right? I mean, like if you want to remain competitive. And so that point about experimentation, it's not like back in 2000, so we're talking about 2006, 2007, where, people were experimenting with like having a social media presence.
Yes.
Right? It's just not the same.
No.
And, back then you could be very tentative and people were putting budgets into it, but it was very tentative. This is much more about actually fundamentally, like, how do we utilize this to improve the margins in our business or drive new revenue streams? And and what is everyone else doing? So it's going to be, I think it's a highly disruptive period we're looking forward to. But starting with the use case, being prepared to experiment with that use case and fail, and continue to work at it, I think is probably, you're right, the key takeaways.
100%. I think this is the only way to go forward with AI as well. As you said, this is the right framework.
Yeah, and have your data
identify the right use case. Allow yourself, the time, the budget, the resources to experiment with it. Make sure that it fits all the requirements for your specific use case, and then be prepared to fail.
Yeah,
I think we have to learn a lot from the wider technology kind of industry and software development and stuff like that.
For sure,
there is a reason why you have to go through the process. You to make mistakes even to then get better, right? So, and I know some organizations are kind of risk averse, or depending on the size, depending on the industry, again, they don't have this allowance.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think we need to find a way. We need to find the right spot where failure is not considered a bad thing anymore.
Yeah,
failure is part of the learning process. We read something, we can't understand it, we go back and we figure it out, and similarly in business applications, we can find a way to actually leverage technology the way we want it, we need it, but we need to consider the possibility of failing first. Yeah. And I think this is a good educational process. And then finally, as you said, the data itself, right? The data foundation, as I call it, the data assets, to be in the right place, in the right shape.
Yeah.
So, which I was going to say, back to the effective versus defensive strategies, I would highly advise everyone, since we're talking about, again, to add another element to the previous question, I guess, is let's look at the basics, right? There is a bigger conversation, and I'm happy about this these days in the wider data and AI community of people realizing, what do we do actually with our data?
Yeah.
What do we do? AI is not going to run itself. Are we prepared to do that? Are we prepared to feed our use cases?
Yeah.
Are we in a position to actually securely, from an ethical perspective and
allow AI access to it?
Exactly.
Control and manage that. Absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah. And it's, it's interesting times ahead. And I really appreciate this conversation and you coming and hanging out with us today. And I look forward to hearing about your successes in this area again sometime, hopefully.
Thank you for having me again. I really enjoyed our chat.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, really, really, really good to talk about a topic that, I think there is a lot of interest right now.
Yeah.
There is a lot of misconception, but I think, again, we all need to navigate this somehow.
Yeah, I think we have a plan. Let's go do it.
Let's do it.
Okay, cheers. Thanks, guys. Well, good. Good. Fantastic. This is really in my face.
Taking a photo?
Yeah, of course.
That was really good, yeah.